I can't stand it when people fervently believe falsehoods, lies, and misconceptions. It's the very reason my channel exists. And that means I live during a very target-rich era. But it's also not good for my peace of mind. I think that's why I have not been doing much comedy anymore. No inspiration. I'm not finding much to be humorous about. Basically, the state of the world is depressing to me right now. The worst kind of falsehoods to believe are the ones that cause harm in the world. And those are the ones spreading rampantly right now. But today, I'd like to talk about one of the oldest and most persistent falsehoods. There's a book of the Bible that either directly or indirectly has been extremely influential in how modern people perceive God. And when I say indirectly, I mean that it has influenced people who haven't even read it, because it has helped shape cultures and religions. Even people who haven't read it repeat verses and concepts from this book. And what's bad about this book's influence is that it's one of the most despicable and disgusting books in the Bible. Yet it isn't perceived that way. People get inspiration and comfort out of it. And that just contributes further into a great skewing away from what is real and good. Sort of like how a drug might make you feel good, but it isn't good for you. And because this book is included in the Bible, it is given ultimate authority. People accept it as being true and right just because other people, ancient, long-gone people we don't know, decided to include it in the compilation of books we know as the Bible. What's ridiculous about that is we have no idea who wrote it. That's true of many books of the Bible, of course, but at least they have alleged authors. This one doesn't even have an alleged author. It's totally anonymous. Imagine writing a story that becomes so influential that it becomes a holy text with the claim that God himself guided your hand in writing it. That's power. Before I talk about the content of the book's story, I'd like to talk about how the book came to be, because many religious people will just assume that a guy sat down one day and was divinely inspired by God to put pen to paper, and he wrote it that way from beginning to end. But history gives us a lot of clues that the true origin of the book looked nothing like that. I'm referring to the book of Job, which has helped shape how religious people justify and respond to evil and suffering. So it is a very significant piece of literature. Now, Job was likely written around 500 BCE. Ezekiel mentions Job, even though Ezekiel is about a time that occurred before 500 BCE. So what's going on there? Well, it could be a few different things. It could be that Ezekiel was written later, but it was about the past. If you wrote about World War II, it doesn't mean that you wrote it during World War II. Some people make the mistake of dating ancient literature based on the subject matter without realizing that the writer may have been composing a historical work. This is especially confusing when those historical writers used prophecies as a way to write history. In other words, they wrote about past events as if they're future events that didn't happen yet, when in fact they did. And many religious people are then tricked into seeing those historical works as fulfilled prophecies. And that may or may not have even been a deliberate attempt to deceive, but merely poetic license. Another possibility is that Job may have been more of an oral tradition before it was properly recorded by a skilled writer. If that was the case, then it could be possible to reference Job before there was an actual book of Job. Regardless, there were other written works before Job that were definitely similar enough to be its inspiration. But given the post-Babylonian Hebrew and Aramaic it was written in, Job was likely written around 500 BCE. You see, the Jews were exiled to Babylon for about a century, until about 538 BCE. Now, given the language of Job, scholars think it was written right after that because Hebrew changed enough to distinguish pre-exile from post-exile, as it was influenced by the Babylonians. Now, that makes sense given the topic and details of the story, too, being about pain and suffering, about being falsely accused, and the idea of there being some sort of celestial rivalry between God and an opposing character that would later evolve into what we know as the devil. Such concepts didn't exist back then the way we know them today. But the book wasn't all written at the same time by the same author either. In a lot of scripture, you have additions from later periods. And we know they're additions because they use language that would not have been used when the original was written. And that's one way we know that certain prophecies were written after the events they're pretending didn't happen yet, so that they can be written as predictions that came true rather than historical writing. For most people who just pick up a Bible and read it, however, nothing will seem out of place, because it has been translated and reworded with them in mind. Most people aren't going to be looking at the earliest manuscripts with deep understandings of the specific forms of language and phrasing that was used thousands of years ago. Those who do devote their lives to such study can recognize changes in authorship and period. Sometimes those later authors even try to emulate the earlier periods in which they're adding to, but they're still detectable. For we laymen, it would look something like this. Romeo and Juliet was written about 400 years ago. The writing is very clearly from a different period than ours. It's English, yet we do not write or talk like that anymore. So we would be able to recognize right away if someone added to Romeo and Juliet with verses written using modern prose. To test that, you tell me which of these versions was the original Shakespeare, version 1 or version 2. Version 1 goes like this. Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured piteous overthrows doth with their death bury their parents' strife. Is that the original, or is version 2 the original, which goes like this? Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene. From ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. One situationship said, "Look, fam, we ain't about that life," and they rizzed each other up and it was straight fire. But L's in the chat, because after all that strife, they both unalived themselves, no cap, I ain't no liar. To us, being contemporaries, there's a comical difference, right? We don't need to be experts to recognize the difference because this is our time, our era. And even the change I did make required me to do some extracurricular study because I'm Gen X, and I had to learn how to properly use Gen Z lingo to make it relevant to the current year. And that's only a few generations. Imagine hundreds of years of generational changes. The point is, what's clear as day to us will be completely obscured from an average person living 2,500 years into the future, the year 4525. First of all, they're going to be speaking a completely different language, even if it's still called English. If you went back in time 1,000 years, you wouldn't understand the old English speakers. So it would be translated, and it would seem cohesive. In the year 4525, scholars and experts in dead languages would likely be able to tell how I changed the Shakespearean verses to Gen Z verses. They would be able to say there's hundreds of years between the types of phrases that are being used. That happens in the Bible, in many places, including Job. It's not something we would expect to see from a document that God Himself wrote through the hand of man. If God had something to do with it, then I would expect it to be right the first time and then to remain untampered with. But that's not the case. The fact that our language clearly evolves throughout the generations also flies in the face of those people who believe that certain events in the book of Genesis literally happened, like God confusing the language so that people would stop being able to coordinate on massive projects like the Tower of Babel, all because they were honoring themselves and their own accomplishments rather than God. Such a petty human way of thinking projected onto God. I've said it over and over, and I'll say it again. God, as depicted in the Bible, is a great insult. The Bible is the greatest blasphemy because it's a very human idea of what a human would be like with ultimate power, and it calls that idea God, the all-knowing and all-perfect. It's actually arrogant human beings calling their own ideas wisdom and claiming that such wisdom came from God, when really it just came from them. And as human morality evolved over the centuries, we can see that the wisdom attributed to God is in many cases quite archaic and far from perfect. As far as the book of Job is concerned, it's not just language that gives it away, but also the subject matter of the story itself. Written right after the Babylonian captivity, we start to see this motif of God having a rivalry with other heavenly characters. And that doesn't really make sense right now because nothing could hope to oppose God as we know Him, especially not while in heaven and in God's presence. But back then, it may have made more sense because God wasn't quite yet fleshed out as we know the character now. In fact, Job played a big part in the evolution of the Abrahamic God. Just the idea of having one main God is a Babylonian influence from Zoroastrianism. Their faith was in the process of converting from polytheism to monotheism, so they developed a one true God called Ahura Mazda, the father of truth, who opposed his evil opposite, Angra Mainyu, which was their devil character, the father of lies. Those ideas heavily influenced the Jews who were deported there for about a century. And from those ideas, the Yahweh versus Satan relationship we know now rises. But that's not how it used to be. A lot of people reinterpreted the stories retroactively. For instance, they put the devil in the Garden of Eden, but that's false. The snake in the Garden of Eden was just a snake. It wasn't some fallen angel devil character. One clue about that is that it included a cute poetic way to explain why snakes don't have legs, because it's a punishment against snakes, not the devil. Obviously, cursing every member of a species based upon what one of them does is not just. But the Abrahamic religions are based on that very concept of collective blame. Remember that these were tribal people, and that's from where we get the very word tribalism. Collective blame was a part of survival in such a world, so naturally they thought of it as just. But that becomes a very big problem when those are the people who pen the holy texts. The idea that such collective blame is just has caused some of the greatest atrocities throughout history, not only committed by people of the Abrahamic faiths, but against them as well. Listen to me very carefully. Collective blame is the source of all bigotry, all prejudice, and the Abrahamic religions are based on the idea of collective blame. So bigotry is basically baked into those religions, I'm sorry to say. And that's not to say that everyone who believes in them is a bigot. No, I'm not saying that. And if I were, then I'd be a hypocrite. But what it does mean is that in order to not be a bigot, they have to struggle with inconsistencies, arguments, and apologetics, all of which are unnecessary struggles because they're in service to holding on to a falsehood. The best and simplest way to resolve that conflict is to let the falsehood go. Another aspect that was different before the transitionary period in which Job was written was that there was a pantheon of gods. They were Canaanite gods, including Yahweh, who was a storm deity, one of the many children of El, the father of the gods. Probably the most ironic aspect of the Bible is that the very idea of not having any other gods before Yahweh is in and of itself a concept that was taken from another god, Ahura Mazda. Of course, none of those gods were real, including Yahweh. They all served their purposes in nature, just like the gods of Greek and Roman mythology. It's just that Yahweh became the most favored as a god of the weather, which was very important during times of drought. There are parts in the Bible in which the Israelites are even desperately appealing to Yahweh during times of drought. So Yahweh was favored, and it eventually became mandatory to worship him and only him, the same way some religious people try to make their religion the law of the land to this day. Some things never change, but religions do. The victory of the Yahweh worshippers required some clever Bible revisionism, in which Yahweh suddenly gets to have multiple names, like El Elyon, which is a totally different god, Yahweh's father, in fact, and the father of all the gods. But they were consolidated into one God. Yahweh had to be the father, so they made El synonymous with Yahweh, despite originally being two totally different characters. El was the old fatherly type, while Yahweh was young and strong and warlike. But the reason we now think of Yahweh as the old bearded man is because that was how people thought of El, and they turned Yahweh into El. Yahweh had a mother too, named Asherah, but she was pretty much slandered away as part of some pagan cult, despite being worshipped by the Israelites very early on. Somebody had to win that conflict, and it was the Yahweh worshippers, as their society became more patriarchal. It's just another way that the Bible was changed, and you can see those earlier changes in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But interestingly enough, some of those damning verses still remain in your modern day Bibles, verses that refer to the pantheon of gods and how El divided the nations, assigning his children to each, and he gave Israel to Yahweh. That's how they saw it before they became monotheistic. Consider the time and place from where we get the book of Job. This tablet is about 200 years older than the book of Job. It's a poem called I Will Praise the Lord of Wisdom. It's a Babylonian tablet written in Akkadian, so this story was in circulation while the Jews were exiled there. It's also known as Poem of the Righteous Sufferer, or the Babylonian Job. It's the exact same subject matter. A righteous man suffers unjustly. He loses his wealth and his health, but remains faithful to the gods and is eventually redeemed. This tablet is from ancient Babylon, and it's called Dialogue Between a Man and His God, and it was written about 1,200 years before Job. It is also about an innocent man who suffers and cries out to the God who afflicted him, and that God eventually delivers him from his suffering and tells us to remain faithful and not to forget God during your suffering, and you will be rewarded. Almost 2,000 years before Job, there's an ancient Sumerian work called Man and His God, about a young man who, despite being good and innocent, suffers illness. His friends turn against him. He cries out to his God about his suffering, wondering why his God is putting him through all of this, because he doesn't think he has done anything to deserve it. He cries this quote, "The Asag demon, the evil one, bathes in my body," unquote. So we have this idea, thousands of years before Job, that God is allowing an evil entity to torment one of his faithful followers who doesn't deserve it. His cries for help eventually win over his God, and his God finally delivers him from his suffering and brings him joy and happiness in the end. So, you see, there's a long history of what we would call remakes that lead up to Job. It's not that this story was inspired by some great mysterious universe creator as a personal lesson for all of us to know about God's ways and nature. No, it's far less romantically and far more realistically just another version of a well-established trope from the area in which it originated, which is exactly what we would expect to see in a 100% natural world, and exactly not what we would expect to see if a one true God guided the hand of the author who wrote Job. This story of the Bible, like so many others, are remakes from other gods. Several of the Genesis stories, for instance, are from older Mesopotamian and Sumerian religions. In other words, if you hold up these stories as sacred texts and include them in your worship, you are sort of inadvertently violating the first commandment, to have no other gods before Yahweh. It's sort of impossible not to violate that commandment if you believe in the Bible, because the Bible is of other gods. Adhering to the first commandment is futile and hopeless, especially when you consider that the modern version of Yahweh is in and of itself a compilation of gods. Maybe it's the case that the atheist is the only one who can truly come the closest to obeying the first commandment, to have no other gods before Yahweh, because the atheist follows no other gods at all. The book of Job starts out with establishing Job as a good, God-fearing man with a lot of success and a big family. Then the story shifts to God meeting up with a bunch of angels. What you have to understand here is that this is a story. It's not meant to be presented as eyewitness testimony like the Gospels. It's not claiming that the author witnessed God in heaven conversing with a bunch of angels, though bizarrely there are Christians who think that this is a historical account of something that actually happened. Anyway, one of the angels is singled out as a character with a proper name, that name being capital S, Satan. That's how it is presented to us today, but not how it would have been read back then. Back when this book was written, Satan was not a proper name. The Hebrew used here was ha-Satan, which means the adversary or the accuser. So in the book, God singles out one of the angels who was wandering around on earth, but in modern Christianity, people see that character as the devil. And that's not the only difference as far as how the religion has evolved. Many forms of modern Christianity would have been considered blasphemy a few hundred years ago. And many forms of Christianity a few hundred years ago would have been considered blasphemy a few hundred years before that. Various aspects of the religion become unrecognizable over the years, but because you grow up with the current version, to you, it may feel like the version that always existed. It's the same reason that after a few generations of peace, eventually a generation comes along that has no memory of war and has to relearn through experience that war is bad. Back to the book of Job. God points out Job to this angel who is established as an adversary. Now, Job would not have suffered his troubles if God had not taken the initiative to point him out. God declares that Job is blameless and good, that he fears God and shuns evil. That's God's judgment of Job. So there can be no argument about that. Job being good is established as objective fact, and we as flawed mortals aren't allowed to have an opinion about that. The all-knowing said so. Job is a very wealthy man, and he clearly has God's favor, which is interesting to me, considering what Jesus had to say about how difficult it is for a rich man to enter heaven. Job would not have that problem. And God asks this adversary angel if he has considered Job. Bear in mind that God supposedly knows everything already. So by singling out Job, he already knows the outcome, and that it will result in Job's suffering and the deaths of his children. He knows the whole story ahead of time. He knows what the angel thinks of Job, and the angel knows that God knows what he thinks of Job. So you may wonder, why does God even bother asking? A common sentiment would be that it's not for God's understanding, but for our own. The same reason a teacher would ask a student a question. Obviously, the teacher already knows the answer, but the question is for the student's consideration. My father used to ask me questions in which he already had the answer, or at least an opinion, but he wanted to hear my answer so that he could give his input on it, whether to express agreement or to argue or whatever, not for his edification, but for mine. So that's understandable. But that doesn't solve the problem that God is the one who knowingly initiated an interaction that would lead to immense suffering and death. So he must have had a very good reason, right? The accuser answers God by saying that Job is only a faithful servant of God because God has made his life so good. But if God simply took away everything he has, then he would curse God. God's response to that doesn't need to be the challenge that it is. God isn't like us. What God says is, period. God could simply answer, no, you're wrong. And that would have to be accepted as the truth because God knows all. God could answer hypothetically. God could show the accuser a vision of an alternate reality to see Job's reaction if they did mess with his life. The bottom line is that the accuser would know, by default, God is correct. And that could be the end of it. But that's not what happens, because then there wouldn't be a story. Have you ever seen a movie in which the protagonist could have just done a simple thing in the beginning to avoid all the problems of the rest of the movie? But if he did that, then there wouldn't be a movie. Same thing here. You could argue that the story itself is the alternate reality, that it never really happened, and it's just meant as a tool to teach us. But if the story is meant to teach something about a particular character, then flaws apparent with that character in the story are carried with it. In other words, the hypothetical doesn't help God's character because God's character is included as an integral part of the story. God tells the accuser to go ahead and do it. Take away everything that Job has. You're even allowed to kill his children if you want to. Abuse Job all you want, and you'll see that he will remain loyal to me. Does that sound like the sentiment of perfect benevolence to you? God's only rule is that he's not allowed to kill Job. And after everything is taken from Job, including his family, see how he reacts, and you'll see that God is right. That response alone should have told the accuser that he was wrong about how Job would react, but for some reason decides to take God up on this pissing match. What could that reason be? Here's what I think. This may have made much more sense in the ancient world, but in the modern world we have a history of apologetics that establishes God as the greatest of all possible things. So it doesn't make any sense for an angel to get into a pissing match with him, especially while in the presence of God himself. But it may have made more sense in the ancient world. It's like when the Christians try to make the point that even the demons believe in God. See, that's not a very good point at all. In fact, I would consider that a point for the non-believer, that it's very unrealistic for beings that have first-hand knowledge of God to even try to resist him. Regardless, the book of Job comes from an era and a location when people were just moving out of polytheism. So way back then, coming out of ancient Persia, it may have made more sense to depict God as having a little more competition. The accuser ends up doing everything God allows him to do. He kills all of Job's 7 sons and 3 daughters. He takes away all of Job's many animals and possessions. In response, Job is very stoic and prays to God rather than cursing God. It's from there that we get the old saying, "The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away." That was Job's reaction, total acceptance. And the same thing happens again. On another day, the angels all meet up with God, and God throws it in the accuser's face, basically saying, "Ha! You were wrong about Job, weren't you?" And the accuser responds that Job would curse God if Job himself were physically afflicted rather than just losing everything he has, including his family. So God tells him to go ahead and do it, just as long as he doesn't kill Job. Again, that should be more than enough to tell the accuser that he'd lose that argument. God is always right, no matter what. What I find interesting here is that the accuser is not allowed to kill Job, yet he is allowed to kill Job's sons and daughters. That interests me because it establishes a sort of hierarchy of life. Job's life matters more. The lives of his sons and daughters are apparently worth the lesson that God is teaching here, a lesson that simply must be taught through example. This means that the very purpose of the lives of Job's children was to inflict suffering upon their father, to cause him to mourn, born to die, so that their father could, in turn, be used in a lesson to teach a solution of sorts to the problems of evil and suffering, a non-solution that says God's reasons are good by definition. So with God's permission, the accuser angel inflicts Job with painful sores that cover his whole body, yet Job remains faithful to God. Job's wife reacts by asking why Job is holding on to his integrity, and she tells him to just curse God and die. Have you ever seen a story in which one of the characters seems to base their decisions on nothing more than somehow magically knowing the plot of the story? That's bad writing, because the character doesn't have a believable motivation. They're inexplicably clairvoyant, and they're not reacting naturally to what's happening around them. It's like Job's wife knows that the fastest way to end the disagreement between God and the accuser is to take the side of the accuser so that there's nothing more to prove. Essentially, take the quick and easy path rather than the long, hard path. It's especially disjointed, considering that she also would have been grieving, and she also just lost as much as Job did. But Job is the main character here, so by golly, everyone in the story will revolve around him, including his wife, who responds to all of this in the most unnatural and unrealistic way anyone would react. Job responds to her by calling her a foolish woman, that if they're going to accept the good from God, then they should also accept the bad. Here we notice the rather consistent theme that finds its way into the Bible over and over again, that women are constantly either causing trouble for men or at least trying to cause trouble. This was a very patriarchal society that deleted their goddess, Asherah, mother of all the gods. They wanted to have women thoroughly under their control, and they did it back then in the same way men who want to control women do it today, by demeaning them and trying to paint them as lesser, as inferior. Of course, they are very much not inferior, and the irony is that the very thing that causes such a motive is born of insecurity, which comes from fear of being inferior. In other words, men who seek to subjugate women are doing so through compensation for their own inadequacies. Competent, confident, good men take pleasure in helping others and eventually seeing those they help surpass them, regardless of whether those doing the surpassing are women. They aren't threatened by those who surpass them. They encourage it. That's how they make the world a better place. Instead of wishing for death, Job makes the rather insightful and interesting lament that he wished he had never been born. That is much more of a realistic attitude. You might think that at least Job did have a good life before all of this happened, so why would he wish that none of it happened at all? Because it's not wise, it's realistic. That's just how people operate. People don't think that it's better to have loved and lost than to never have loved at all. It is far easier for a man who has always been poor to find happiness than a poor man who was once rich. Now, I'm sure that's not true of everyone, but typically, people acclimate to their standards of living. If you've never had a taste of the good life, then the ignorance of the good life sort of insulates you from the sadness of not having it. Even if you think you can imagine it, I'm sure you won't comprehend the nuances without first-hand experience. But if you have experienced the good life and then you lose it, you have that knowledge of what it's like and that you no longer have it. And that knowledge sort of constantly plagues you. And that, I believe, that feeling of loss can be a much worse feeling than never having it at all. So this part of Job, in my opinion, is pretty insightful. And remember that this story is coming from a group of people that did lose everything. So again, it makes sense that they would understand this nuance. The story then shifts to a much more poetic style to represent Job's three friends who come to visit him during his time of turmoil. Their belief is that Job is being punished for some sort of sin that he has kept secret, and that all Job needs to do is acknowledge and confess that. But Job knows that's not true. He did nothing wrong. Even God, at the very beginning of the story, calls Job blameless. So we as the reader know that Job is an innocent man. And that's why I say it makes sense for the Jews to adopt this story as they came out of exile. They suffered and felt wrongly accused, so I'm sure this story really resonated with them, and you could see how such reverence could cause this book to evolve into a holy text. Now, despite knowing that he is blameless, Job then acknowledges God's power and wisdom and declares that he could never defend himself against God. He could never win an argument against God, and therefore defend the idea that he doesn't deserve what's happening to him. What's interesting here is that Job knows and understands that he could never win an argument against God. But the accuser angel, who personally knows God and has stood in God's presence, doesn't understand that. This is yet another case of characters being driven by the plot rather than by their own nature. God is always right no matter what, which is divine command theory. Something is right by default because God does it. God doesn't have to play by his own rules. Basically, such a theory takes logic and throws it right out the window. Job knows that God is always right, too, but for some reason, the angel doesn't. Job credits God with all the various wonders of nature. At least they were wonders at the time, and then admits such things are beyond his knowledge. So too is his suffering. What's funny about this part is that what is so mysterious and bewildering to Job, the reason for his suffering, is something we know as the reader. What Job doesn't know is what we do know. We know why Job is suffering. It's because God is trying to prove a point to an accuser angel. And if we go with the lore of Christianity and accept that this accuser angel is in fact the devil, then it's a point from which the devil will not learn. The devil's character is in no way improved by the lesson of Job's suffering. He doesn't undergo a moral arc in the story. He remains inexplicably evil with zero motivation, zero hope to win, and learns zero from God's point that results in immense suffering for Job and the deaths of his children. The best argument I could think of in response to this is that the lesson was not intended for the accuser, for the devil, but for us as the readers, and that Job never actually happened. Now, as I said before, however, the problem with that is that the logic behind the story, whether it happened or not, remains problematic because it's justifying suffering that is unjustifiable. Now, the usual argument against proclaiming that an action of God is unjustifiable is that we can't tell if it's justifiable or not from our limited human perspective because we don't comprehend God's ways. But this is different because this story makes those ways explicit in this particular instance. So for Job's suffering in particular, we as the reader are privy to the reason, and it's most certainly not a good reason. Job cries out for the reason. He wants to know why this is happening to him. Now, if Job did hear the real reason, I don't think it would impress him. It should infuriate him, but alas, Job is never told. But Job's friends pretty much call him foolish for even wanting to know. They say that God is too mysterious, that Job wouldn't even comprehend the answer. It's the old God works in mysterious ways shtick. What's interesting here, though, is the answer is certainly not inconceivable to us, the readers, as we are allowed to know God's reason in this instance. So Job would comprehend it just fine, just as we do. God is wronging Job in order to teach a lesson to others, a lesson that is ironically undermined by the very method in which the lesson is being taught. Job, too, starts to show signs of having the knowledge of the author who wrote him, however, because despite acknowledging that he has no idea why God is putting him through all of this, he claims to know that he will be justified in the end, and that the reason will indicate that it has nothing to do with anything Job did wrong, because he is blameless. Job somehow knows the lesson being taught here is not for him, because he says that he will not change his ways. He knows his ways are good and in God's favor, despite seemingly not being in God's favor. It seems to me that he has plot knowledge at this point. The Bible repeatedly says that a man reaps what he sows, and that sentiment is even repeated in the book of Job as an argument by his friends who are seen as foolish, who are depicted as foolish. Yet they are merely reciting a recurring lesson in the Bible, one that is totally undermined by this story, because Job is most definitely not reaping what he has sowed. And bear in mind that the very reason this story exists is to explain why some people do not reap what they sow. Essentially, the Bible is trying to have its cake and eat it too. And that's not necessarily an inconsistency with the individual stories of the Bible, but problems and contradictions arise when you try to make a coherent compilation of books that were never written with the specific intent to be part of a compilation. In other words, the writers of the books in the Bible did not intend for a Bible to be made out of them, but because a Bible was made out of them, many problems and contradictions arise. One of Job's younger friends pleads with him to confess his sins, thinking that God is probably not listening to his pleas because he refuses to acknowledge his guilt. Now, during this speech, he also tries to appeal to God's mysterious ways that are beyond them. He says, quote, "How great is God, beyond our understanding. The number of his years is past finding out. He draws up the drops of water, which distill as rain to the streams. The clouds pour down their moisture, and abundant showers fall on mankind. Who can understand how he spreads out the clouds, how he thunders from his pavilion? See how he scatters his lightning about him, bathing the depths of the sea. This is the way he governs the nations and provides food in abundance. He fills his hands with lightning and commands it to strike its mark. His thunder announces the coming storm. Even the cattle make known its approach." Unquote. He goes on describing storms as the domain of God, a process Job cannot possibly hope to understand, yet a process that God knows all too well. Do you see how we're in a transitional period here? That's what's so fascinating about when this was written. They were in the process of transitioning Yahweh from a minor storm deity to the father of the gods, taking El's place, and eventually just to the one and only God of all. It's interesting to note the parallels to Zeus as well, also being a storm deity and the king of the gods, so perhaps there was some influence from Zeus. I don't know if that's the case, but it appears that Zeus was an established deity long before Yahweh was. At least the oldest mention of Zeus we have is from the 13th century BCE, which is about 400 years older than the oldest mention of Yahweh. So if one did influence the other, it would be Zeus influencing Yahweh. Just to put things into perspective, the earliest mentions of Yahweh are from about 3,000 years ago, but the earliest mentions of other gods, like Ishtar, are from Mesopotamia 3,000 years before Yahweh. Incidentally, Ishtar gained her knowledge of sex by eating some fruit from a tree of knowledge, which was guarded by a serpent. In terms of Yahweh originally being a storm deity, another suspicious part of Job is toward the end of the story, at the climax, when Yahweh finally shows up and answers Job. How does he do it? He comes out of a storm. And God is pissed that Job is making demands of him. He doesn't like that Job maintains his righteousness and is asking for explanations. He implies that Job is being arrogant and decides to put him down by asking where he was when God Almighty created the world. God gives him the "I was in Nam while your mama was still changing your diapers" speech. God basically tells Job that he's nothing compared to God. What's funny to me about all of this is that God never answers Job. He never addresses Job's suffering, never tells him why his 7 sons and 3 daughters were killed, that it all was just to prove a point. Even the writer sees that such a thing could never be realistically addressed by the God character because it would make him look bad. It would be difficult to sell that reason to Job as a good enough reason to sacrifice his children. And what we have here is a human writer presuming to know how an infinitely wise being would behave and speak in such a situation, assuming such a being would ever even end up in such a situation. And as that writer speaks as God and describes the world in terms he imagines God would, it becomes clear to a modern learned person that he is describing the world exactly as an ancient mortal man, not a god, would perceive the world. Now, some, I imagine, would say that God would communicate with ancient mortal man in ways they would understand. But the very reason we transitioned out of those ancient mentalities and into greater knowledge informed by the scientific method is because we, as human beings, are able to be taught. But the Bible teaches nothing that ancient people wouldn't have already known. We all start out as children knowing nothing. Same now as back then. A child born thousands of years ago may learn how to farm and hunt, yet know nothing about how the earth was formed. But it will be precisely the opposite for a child born in the 21st century who can easily learn how the earth was formed, and likely never learn how to farm and hunt. God could have taught ancient people things that were clearly beyond them, but that is never demonstrated in the Bible. There's no Einsteins in the Bible bestowing upon us an E=mc², knowledge that was bragging rights for God in the ancient world is elementary for a modern child. So, with God's sudden presence and reaction to the disasters that befell Job, we see that Job is humbled in the most pitiable way. But if we step outside of the narrative a bit, if we disobey the direction the author is trying to lead us in, we see that in fact, Job was right all along, and that God is the one who was being a petty, arrogant jerk. That reeks of a story not inspired by God, but one of a flawed human intellect struggling to imagine how a perfect and all-powerful being would behave. That is why God behaves like such a human at the end of Job, because he was written by a human. I know that struggle. When I wrote the Shadow of the Tyrant King series, I came up with characters that were vastly diverse in terms of intellect. There was an oafish teenager, and there was also an extremely wise old lord of a realm who was practically a god himself. When you write such a character, you are risking arrogance. You are presuming to know what a very wise person will say in various situations. Now, I was cognizant of that fact, so I knew I had to keep my arrogance in check. The writer of Job didn't do that. The writer of Job poured his own personality into God and made God arrogant. But arrogance is not wise. You might say, doesn't God have a right to be arrogant, though? After all, he's the greatest of all possible things, right? In this case, it's totally unwarranted, because God doesn't need to justify his power to Job. Job and all of his friends spend the whole book acknowledging all the great things God does and creates. The last thing God needs to do is show up and justify that to these people who just spent the whole book passionately acknowledging it. What he really needed to justify was why Job was suffering. And that's the one thing he didn't justify, because he couldn't, because it would make him look bad. So God's showboating at the end of the book is basically a red herring to divert us away from what kicked this whole thing off. And in such stories where there are perfect characters, the story cannot acknowledge their flaws in any way, even when they do bad things in the story itself. Whoever wrote Job, I suspect, was an abuser, because the good guy, God, behaves exactly like an abuser in the story. And nobody would make the good guy an abuser, except either an author who is an abuser and has no self-awareness, or if the character has a moral arc and changes throughout the story to become the good guy, which can't be the case for God, who is already perfect and unchanging. God essentially tells Job that he is nothing compared to him. Job acknowledges that and cowers before God, but that doesn't deter God from continuing to berate Job. God tells Job that he could never correct God. In other words, he could never win an argument against God, which was something Job acknowledged back at the beginning of the story, remember? So God then responds, "Who are you to question me?" Now we, as the reader, already know the answer to the question that God refuses to answer for Job. We know God's reasons. We know that God acknowledged Job's blamelessness. We know that God used Job to win an argument. We know that what happened to Job was unjust. God refuses to tell Job that, and instead pretends like his reasons were sound and righteous. They were not. Instead, the God character in this story goes on and on and on for several chapters, literally bragging about all the things he can do that Job cannot. Such a very human way of writing God. That would be like a human being standing before an ant and bragging in a long villain monologue about how easy it would be for him to just brush aside the entire anthill with his foot. But who would take the time to converse with an ant that way? A wise man? Now, because of all this, Job regretted wanting answers from God. Job was made to feel like the arrogant one, like he even deserved an explanation from the Almighty. Well, God showed up and said, "Who are you to make demands of me?" You see the abusiveness here? The truth is, God didn't have a good reason, but Job was made to feel like God did have a good reason, a reason that he would never come to know. That is how abusers operate. When the cheating husband comes home and the wife questions him, the husband goes on the attack. "How dare you question me? How dare you insinuate?" But the wife is right to question him, yet she is still gaslit into feeling like the unreasonable one, and she is made to feel bad and guilty. That is what happened to Job, but because the story was written by someone who was likely an abuser, we are expected to accept the abuser character as the good and right character. He is not. One of the harms this story does, especially as such an influential story, is that it presents the abusive character as the good guy. Not just a good guy, but the perfectly good guy. At the very end of the story, God rebukes Job's friends for saying wrong things about God. And remember that those wrong things were that God must have good reasons for doing what he does. So it's kind of funny to me that God says they were wrong, in a sense, tacitly admitting that he did not have a good reason for doing what he did, thereby making them right. It's kind of paradoxical. Job's friends were wrong about Job being punished for committing some secret sin, but the logic of Job's friends expressed about God are used by believers to this day, despite the fact that they were presented as wrong in this story. They try to justify Job's suffering. They appeal to God having a good reason for such suffering. What's the point of acknowledging good and evil, happiness and suffering, if it all serves God's plan in the end? If it's all in service to God's plan, then you can justify literally anything, because everything is justified by default. Why? Because if God allows it to happen, then it's necessarily part of his plan. So literally everything that happens is for the greater good and thus justified, even atrocities. So under theism, there is no real point to separating good from evil. Job's friends rebuke Job for wanting an explanation from God, basically shaming him for wanting to put God to the test. In other words, to trust God and not demand proof from him, which is something the Bible says you shouldn't do. Gee, I wonder why. But what's interesting about that is the story itself exists because God complies with being put to the test by an adversary angel. So, if you want God to prove something to you, then forget about it. You'll just piss God off. But if the devil wants God to prove something, then God will snap to it. A funny alternate version of the story could be that Satan just wanted to be able to torture someone with God's blessing. So the whole idea of losing an argument to God was a ruse, essentially reverse psychology on God, and God fell for it. In that case, Satan would be the winner because he would get exactly what he wanted all along. It would be like losing an argument on purpose with someone by telling them, "I bet you would never give me $1 million. And then the person responds, "Oh yeah? Here you go," and gives you the $1 million. And then you'd have to say, "Oh, well, I guess I lost that argument. You were right. Good job. You won." But let's get back to how the story actually ends, which is actually far more absurd, if you can believe it. After rebuking his friends, God gives Job twice as much as he had before, doubling the number of animals he owned. Now bear in mind that this is after God berates Job for a couple of chapters. This is also classic abuser behavior. The abuser abuses his loved one, then feels bad, and then tries to reward the abused person somehow to assuage their own guilt. And then God gives Job 3 new daughters and 7 new sons. And the author feels the need to point out that Job's 3 new daughters are the most beautiful women in all the land. Such an unbelievably childish way of thinking. I wonder if Job had these 10 new children with the same wife, the one who told him to curse God and die. She is never addressed or brought up again in the story. She just served her purpose as the bad woman encouraging bad things to happen and then exited stage left permanently. The story did have an opportunity to teach more poignant lessons about suffering. Job could have been an example of resilience. What if, instead of wallowing in misery, Job got back to work and rebuilt his life? What if his friends got together and pitched in to help Job? No. Instead, we get the message to just take it. Assume there's a good reason for it, and wait for God to put things right. Well, how many people have you known whose lives were never put right? How many people just died at the end of their suffering? In terms of Job's children, I can address that point from experience, though it should be intuitive to you even if you didn't experience it. I had a son who died, and then I had another son a few years later. I love my son probably more than anyone else in the world, yet even though that's the case, he is in no way a replacement for my first son. And because I love him, I cannot think of him as a warranty or an insurance policy. These are people we're talking about, not possessions. And this attitude of replacing children to make things right in the end is further evidence that the author of this book is an abuser, thinking of people as replaceable possessions and presuming that would be the just reaction of a wise and righteous God. Notice how, in the end, it's still all about Job. The story must revolve around Job, even though we're dealing with the lives and deaths of others. People died and were born, all because of a disagreement that swirled around Job's reactions, all pawns in the game of Job's life. Why? Well, for the simple reason that Job is the main character of this story. That's why. So we are to give no consideration to the lives of others. The story doesn't obey reality, it obeys the plot, the purpose for which it was created. One of the main lessons religious people seem to have gleaned from Job is that your righteousness doesn't matter. As the Bible repeatedly states, your righteous deeds are like filthy rags to God. The book of Job gives us mixed messages about that. In the beginning, God acknowledged Job's righteousness even to the point of taking pride in it, so clearly not like filthy rags. Yet in the end, Job's righteousness was not enough to spare him from immense suffering. So yes, maybe like filthy rags after all. Religious people may find inspiration from the story, from when they suffer, and it gives them comfort that all will be made right and to just trust in God. But it can also carry the message that their goodness doesn't really matter, that the wicked profit and the good suffer. What motivations can possibly be derived from such sentiment? Well, it can offer an internal excuse for when people do bad things. They get to say, I'm only human. If you believe all people sin and you are a person, then you will find ways to make excuses for yourself. After all, this is who you are. This is your nature. You are born to fail. That's what the Bible instills, whether it intends to or not. We as non-believers, however, don't have any excuses. We must be good for goodness sake. We don't need a book with 42 chapters to justify why bad things happen to good people in a world in which God exists. We know that the whole problem is resolved simply by removing God from the equation. Delete the 42 chapters and suddenly everything makes perfect sense. Bad things will happen to good people, and good things will happen to bad people, simply because there is no celestial judge, no perfectly good guiding hand that cares about us and loves us. It's just nature and we're on our own and the world is what we make of it, when you understand that simple fact, everything just makes sense. And suddenly, you don't need all these flawed human stories designed to untie an impossible knot that should have never been tied in the first place.